Welcome to the ORS Virtual Scientific Session, Ingredients for a Winning Conference Abstract, organized by Drs. Hisham Drissi and Hani Awad. I am pleased to introduce today's session organizers, Drs. Hisham Drissi and Hani Awad. Dr. Drissi is a professor of orthopedic and vice chair of research at Emory University. He has been an ORS member for close to 2 decades and has served on several ORS committees. Currently, he is the chair of the ORS Publications Advisory Board and the director of the Art of Grantsmanship Workshop. Hisham's research focuses on 3 areas of orthopedic investigations, which include skeletal homeostasis, aging and repair, cartilage regeneration and osteoarthritis, and stem cells and degenerative disc disease. Dr. Awad is professor of orthopedics and biomedical engineering and the associate director of the Center for Musculoskeletal Research at the University of Rochester in New York. His lab focuses primarily on musculoskeletal tissue engineering with an emphasis on challenging clinical problems and translational solutions using in vivo and in vitro models of tissue repair, including tendon, cartilage, and bone. Dr. Awad has been a member of the ORS since 2000 and has served the Society in various capacities. Most recently, he has served as poster session chair at the 2020 annual meeting. He is currently a member of the ORS Research Council and chair of the ORS 2021 Annual Program Committee. At this time, I am happy to present Dr. Hisham Drissi.
Thank you very much for the introductions. I'd like to thank everyone for attending this webinar. We have selected 2 outstanding presenters with exceptional qualifications to be able to convey to you some tricks as to how to write a winning abstract. I think this is great, and it happens at a fantastic time where we're getting ready to submit abstracts to our national meeting. So I am going to introduce Dr. Alice Wong, and my co-chair is going to introduce Dr. Joel Burkle. So Dr. Huang is an associate professor in the Department of Orthopedics at Mount Sinai in New York. Her laboratory has been focusing on tendon biology and bioengineering in the context of both regeneration and fibrosis. Dr. Huang is a long-standing member of the ORS meeting and community and has served in the past and continues to serve as abstract reviewer, session moderator, and is a former member of the Women's Leadership Forum and the Strategic Initiatives Committee. She currently serves as a topic co-chair for tendon and ligament and is a member of the advisory board for the ORS Musculoskeletal Biology Workshop. So thank you, Alice, for being here, and please share your presentation with the group.
All right, thank you for that kind introduction, and it's really great to be here to share some of my thoughts on this topic. So for the overview, I think I'm just going to briefly mention what is an ORS abstract and how it's distinct from other abstracts, the purpose of submitting an abstract, the goals of a successful abstract, and the elements of an abstract that really help you achieve those goals, and then close out with some of the common reasons for rejection. Before turning it over to the second part of this webinar by Joel Burkle on engineering a winning abstract. So what is an ORS abstract? So I trained in the bioengineering field. So for most of my training, I really thought a conference abstract was in this format with very distinct sections, a lot of data, figures and tables and quantitation to support the, kind of your claims. It really wasn't until my postdoctoral training where I realized that actually many conferences, in fact, most conferences have the second type of abstract, which I call Exhibit B, where it's really a kind of abstract that we see mostly in manuscripts, so a short summary of the work without any of the rigor and supporting data to back up your statements. And I think the difference here is an ORS abstract is peer reviewed, and so it's really a much more detailed kind of thing, and to put together an abstract that has all of these components can be actually quite challenging. So the purpose of submitting an abstract is really to communicate your unpublished research and obtain feedback. And I emphasize unpublished because you're really not supposed to submit published work as an abstract. And obtaining the feedback at these early stages of your project can be really helpful as you flesh it out. During the meeting, the abstract and your work, of course, can also serve to attract an audience and expand your professional network. And this is, again, very helpful for your career because you're establishing yourself as an expert in a particular topic. And kind of the more you attend the meeting, the more people associate you with that work, the more you become known for something. And people know to reach out to you for that specific expertise. An ORS abstract itself is also a research product. Again, it is peer-reviewed. Not everything is accepted. And so I have used them myself as citations in a proposal where I might want to show some preliminary data that hasn't been published yet as a full manuscript. And as a student or a trainee, it's also an important demonstration of productivity and achievement. So something to update your committee members on about how you've been progressing by demonstrating that you've submitted this abstract and presented at the meeting. It's also been helpful for myself in progress reports to, again, demonstrate that you've been productive. So the goal of a successful abstract, I think, the baseline is really to get it accepted. And there are a couple of different types of presentations that you can have: podium presentation where you get up and speak in front of the audience, or a poster presentation where you present your poster. More recently, the ORS also has this new category of poster presentations called a moderated poster, which is sort of in between these two types. And I would say that both types of presentations really have their advantages, and I like both. So the podium presentation has somewhat of an enhanced reputation. You can really have the chance to speak to everybody in your field. But it also has potentially a more restricted audience because at the ORS meeting, there are many different parallel sessions. And so people who are attending one session may miss your presentation. And then you don't really have a poster that you can point people to if they weren't there. And so that's kind of one reason I also really like the poster presentation because you can, as long as the poster's up, you can still point people to that research. And you can also have more direct interactions and longer conversations with people about your research that you might not be able to have in a podium presentation. So I think there are really advantages to both. But ultimately, for an abstract to be successful, you need to be able to communicate your research clearly. And so how to do this in one page can be a challenge. To me, I think what you really need to focus on is to present a cohesive story that can really stand alone on its own, or do a good job of using it as a window into the broader story so people can very immediately see what the future directions might be for this project that you're presenting. Something that I try to emphasize to my lab, and something that was emphasized to me during my training, is that the ultimate goal, I think, of a successful abstract is to really turn it into a published manuscript. So if this is the way that you're approaching the abstract, then you will find that you will put in the effort that is required to really have really solid and rigorous research that will hold up the abstract, but ultimately needs to be in the paper. So I think for any of your research project, that ultimate goal needs to be what is in mind, and the abstract is just one of the steps to get there. So an example from my lab where we have turned our ORS abstracts ultimately into a paper, you can see, I just kind of want you to focus more on the dates rather than a project, is that the first abstract for this really came out in 2016, and it wasn't until 2020 that the paper came out. So there can be quite a lag as you're trying to put together a fuller story of when you start to submit these abstracts and when they really become a paper. But being able to present your work early on to your peers and to your colleagues can be very valuable for getting in that feedback so that you have time to pivot and maybe make adjustments before you're submitting the paper and it's almost too late. And then, of course, this helps to demonstrate productivity during this time when the paper isn't out yet. So the basic components of an ORS abstract is really actually just the same as a paper, but just much shorter. So you have the introduction, your methods, results, discussion, and then what is a little bit unique is a sentence or two on significance and clinical relevance. You can also include references and acknowledgements, but these two sections are optional. I myself always include them, so I think they're actually very helpful. But importantly, everything needs to fit into one page, including any figures and tables. What I would advise strongly is to download the current template using this link and follow the instructions, because while the format and the components are fairly stable from year to year, there could be changes in any given year, and you don't want to be doing last minute formatting or adjustments, when you're trying to submit, which is probably the last day that it's open. So some elements of a successful abstract. I've divided this into kind of two major components, and I think Joel will delve into these things more deeply. But I think you can think of it as impact. So why was this study necessary, and how did this study move the field forward? I think these are two really important things that you have to address in your abstract. Why the study was necessary, probably in your introduction, and how you frame your research question. And then how did this study move the field forward would be in a discussion or significance. So these need to be really there. And then of course the research itself. So how was the study carried out would be in your methods and results. Was the appropriate rigor applied? And then what did your study find out? So just, what are the components of their research? And so that really goes back to, I think, the fundamental element of a successful abstract starts with a research question and the actual research. Without that, it's very hard to come up with a really great abstract, right? The best writer in the world won't be able to do it if the meat of the research is not there. So you need a clear research question that's novel, that hasn't been addressed yet. I personally think it can be both hypothesis-driven and descriptive. There's such an emphasis on hypothesis-driven research questions, but if there's not much that's known in the field, a descriptive study can have tremendous impact. So I don't think you need to limit yourself to one or the other, but you just have to frame it clearly and understand what the impact of the study is. You also really need to have the appropriate study design. That goes back to the rigor. And again, rigorous methods and analyses. So the research of the abstract needs to start far in advance. So this is not to say that I myself have not, started an experiment a couple weeks before the deadline and turned it into an abstract, but I would say that those were not my best abstracts. So, for your career, you can't be doing research for the sake of the abstract. You want to do it for the sake of the project and for the sake of hopefully the manuscript. Try to start early enough with your drafts so that you can get feedback, both from your peers and also from your mentor, senior students or trainees in the lab, people who have submitted abstracts before, because it's such a concise document, you don't have a lot of room to waste. So filling in half the thing with just methods will waste space that you might use for other things. And then this may be a generational thing, but I find that my students tend to like to read everything on the screen, and even if you've read it like 50 times and you think there are no mistakes, when you print it out and read it again, you will find something. And that's what I found. So I think it's always very helpful to print it out. Remember, reviewers will be looking at it, and some of them might be like me, where I do like to print things out. So this is a way to make sure your figures are legible, the text is legible, etc. So there was some behind the scenes thing I thought might be helpful to know, because this is stuff that was a little bit new to me until I became topic chair recently. So each abstract is reviewed and scored by at least 2 reviewers. They will assign a score ranging from 1 to 5, with 5 probably being rejection and 1 being the best. The majority of the abstracts will have scores between 1 and 2.5. The top scoring abstracts are then considered for podium presentations. This will depend on the number of speaking slots that are granted to each topic area. The number of speaking slots correlates to how many abstracts are submitted to that topic area. So this is to say that choosing an appropriate topic area is actually quite important. So don't do it kind of at the last minute as you're submitting, just kind of picking something random. Really give it some thought, what would be the best audience for your work? What is the most appropriate topic area? Because that is how the sessions are organized. So, for me, tendon and ligament is very obvious, but if you're working on something like rotator cuff tendon, then you might want to think like, should that go into shoulder or should that go into tendon and ligament, right? And you can look at previous meetings and the talks from those sessions to see like, oh, maybe this one's more clinical and mine is more basic science. So maybe this is a better topic area for my work. But do give that some thought. And then so the ORS was really kind to provide some statistics for me. So last year, I was just curious how many podium presentations were there and rejections and things like that. So 14% of the accepted abstracts were podium presentations, so over 350. with the remainder being poster presentations or moderated posters, so over 2,000, which is really impressive. The rejection rates I found rather intriguing. So for regular submissions, this year that would be the late September submission, rejections were 6%, but much higher for late-breaking submissions. I'm not entirely sure why, but maybe Hisham and Hani would have some insight on that. But one thing that they wanted me to mention is the ORAS will actually now increase the number of accepted abstracts to provide opportunity to attend the annual meeting. And this is really in response to the fact that many institutions now have a requirement that you need to have an accepted abstract for a meeting. And so I think that's really great news, and that will really open things up as well. So a few common reasons for rejection, and I'm going to mention a couple that are really fundamental, and then maybe a couple that are a little bit more minor. But one major reason would be your research question is really not novel. So I don't want you to think of this as, oh, there's maybe 1 or 2 papers that have done similar work. It's more like everyone really knows this already. So they've done it in many cell types. The fact that you're doing it in maybe one new cell type might not be sufficient novelty. And then another really important reason for rejection is insufficient rigor. So you're drawing a lot of conclusions from a sample size of 1. Maybe you're showing quantitative data and again making conclusions, but there's no mention of statistics anywhere in the abstract, or the statistics are really inappropriate for what you're trying to do. And then finally, maybe there's a fundamental flaw in the methods or the technique that you're using. So you're using qPCR and talking about gene expression, but you're actually saying a lot of things about protein synthesis and things like that. So for the reviewer will flag this as this technique will not be able to generate this kind of data. More fuzzy reasons for rejection could be maybe presentation. So if your figures have very poor resolution that the reviewer is not able to independently verify what you're saying, that could be a reason because they just don't know, is this really supportive, or maybe just major missing components. And then another sort of maybe fuzzy area would be data interpretation. So you're drawing some conclusion that's really not supported by the evidence. For myself, I feel like if the data seems appropriately carried out and is well presented, then maybe I would leave it to the audience to decide whether the conclusions are supported or not, but maybe other reviewers would feel differently. And then I just want to end with a few final thoughts, which is the ORAS is home for many musculoskeletal and orthopedic research, myself included, obviously. And I started going to the ORAS as a technician before graduate school. And at that time, I didn't know anybody, but over the years as I've gone, I've really started to feel like, every year I meet new people, make new friends there, and it's really such a home to me and a really great reunion of sorts whenever I go. And for trainees, it's really the best training ground. So if you look at the presentations, it's really highly skewed toward trainee presentations. And I myself had a lot of practice presenting publicly at the ORAS, and it's such a good training ground for that, to present on the national and kind of international level. It's also a great forum for networking, both with your peers, as well as more senior mentors. I know many of the people I met when we were all grad students now have labs of their own, and it's been really nice to kind of grow up together. And then also there's a lot of opportunity for training involvement and leadership. So as being part of committees or serving as ORAS ambassadors, a lot of ways to just get involved on that level. So I think that I really encourage everyone to get involved, and step 1 is to submit your abstract and get your work out there. And so with that, I'm going to stop my screen share and turn it over to Hani.
So thank you very much for this presentation, very informative. So at this time, I'm going to yield to Dr. Awad, who's going to present the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Hisham, and thank you, Alice, for an outstanding presentation. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Joel Burkle. Dr. Burkle is a self-confessed serial abstract submitter to the ORAS. He has submitted an abstract to the ORAS every year since 2008. He is currently the chair of the Awards and Recognition Committee of the ORAS. Research in his lab at the University of Pennsylvania focuses on understanding the mechanobiology of bone development so that they can create new development mimetic and mechanotherapeutic approaches to bone regeneration. Joel received all his degrees in mechanical engineering from Georgia Institute of Technology and received his PhD in 2011. He completed a postdoctoral training fellowship in vascular biology at the Cleveland Clinic and obtained his first faculty position at the University of Notre Dame. Eventually, he was recruited to the University of Pennsylvania in 2017. He is now jointly appointed as an assistant professor in the departments of orthopedic surgery and bioengineering. So without further introduction, Joel, take it away.
Thank you so much, honey. Thank you, Hisham. Let's see. Full screen here. Okay. So I'm really happy to be here, and Alice, thank you so much for a really spectacular presentation. That was fantastic. So I want to talk about a little bit of a different aspect of preparing an abstract, and today I want to talk about developing efficient and effective storytelling techniques for presenting your data. And I'll begin with my disclosures. I am a regular abstract reviewer for the ORS, and I'm on the Awards and Recognition Committee, but I have no financial conflicts of interest to disclose. Okay, so I want to begin by telling you all about one of my heroes. This guy, Edouard Alfred Martel, was a cave explorer. And he's known as sort of the father of modern speleology, which is the study of caves. And one of the things that he's famous for was developing this method for mapping caves. So he was very obsessed with maps and especially figuring out how do you map out a cave. And here's an example of one of his maps, which is he called a coupe. It's basically like a histological image where you section through this three-dimensional structure. But what I really like about him is the way that he would describe how he felt about the adventures that he went on. And he wasn't just interested in the science of studying caves, but he had this really sort of romantic streak about him. And so I'm going to read this quote to you, but I want you to think about, as I read this quote, think about this sort of as an example of the scientist as a cave explorer. Okay, so he said this after he explored this cave that I'm showing you a picture of here in 1889. He says, "The unknown draws us irresistibly forward. No one has gone before us in these depths. No one knows where we go nor what we see. Nothing so strangely beautiful was ever presented to us. And spontaneously we ask each other the same question. Are we not dreaming?" So I love this, right? It's really beautiful. And I think there's something true about this in being a scientist. There's a sublimity to discovering something that nobody else has seen before, and learning something that is brand new. But most of the time that we spend as scientists doesn't really look like this beautiful sunny cave with greenery. It looks more like this. Right? We spend all of our time stumbling around in the dark, trying to find the edges of the cave, not knowing what direction to go and not knowing what tools to use. And slowly we'll set out, a candle here or there and light up a cavern, but then we don't stay there, right? We go find the darkest, dampest corner of the cave where there's a little bit of a draft, and you run down that hole to see if there's more interesting things to discover. And so when it comes to preparing an abstract for the meeting, right, what we're doing is we're telling people about this exploration that we've just made. Right, the stumbling around in the dark and the finding of a new cave. So what I think how do you think about sitting down to write an ORS abstract? Your job really is to take your audience on a journey. Now the good news is you don't have to be a novelist, and the bad news is that it does take work. And so I want to talk a little bit about how do we make this easy for ourselves. Okay, so you've only got, as Alice described, we've only got one page, and what do we say? If this was a year ago, I would say that your average reviewer is sitting on an airplane reviewing your abstract, right? And now maybe it's even a little bit worse. Your average abstract reviewer is in their kitchen trying to force their kid to stay on Zoom and get their homework done, right? But what this means is that your reviewers are very busy, distracted, people who have lots of things going on in their lives during the small period of time that they're trying to review abstracts. And so when you prepare your abstract, you want to write your abstract for these people. And I have 3 pieces of advice that I think will help do that. The first one is to tell a story. The second principle is less is more. And the third one is show the data. Okay, so let's walk through each one of these. The first one is tell a story. So Robert McKee, who's a famous playwright, said this: stories are how we remember. We tend to forget bullet points. And I love this because as scientists, sometimes we feel more comfortable writing down bullet points, and it's a little bit harder for us to want to present our data in really interesting and compelling ways. I remember when I was first writing abstracts as a graduate student for this meeting, I would write my methods and my results, and then I would just sort of throw in some buzzwords and keywords and stick them together into sentences for the intro and discussion. And I felt like these are not the most important parts of the abstract. What I care about is this exciting data that I have. But when it comes to someone who hasn't been spending every waking moment of their time thinking about that problem, it's much more difficult to take in those new data. So you want to help them by telling a story. So how do we do this? I have two ideas on how to help do this. One is to set the stage, right? And when I started writing abstracts, I didn't want to do this. I didn't want to think carefully about how to introduce the story. It was more just, we do bone regeneration and here's some data, right? And the second principle is mind the gap. Okay, so when it comes to setting the stage, the way that I like to do this for ORS abstracts, for papers, for grants, for anything, is to begin with the big problem, right? And your big problem may be something like osteoarthritis, right? But you are obviously not going to solve the problem of osteoarthritis in this ORS abstract. But your audience has to care about the problem that you're tackling. And if you begin with something that's too nuanced and too small, they're not going to understand how it matters to them. So you want to begin with the big problem, but then you can tell your audience what the barrier is, right? Why is it that we still haven't solved the problem of osteoarthritis? And specifically, what is the gap that I am going to solve, right? So we want to sort of take this funnel approach to point your audience in the direction of your gap that you're going to fill. Now, the second principle here is to mind the gap, to think about how do I set up this gap properly? And I have some do's and don'ts. The do's are have an interesting and important gap. If your gap is too small, your audience isn't going to, your abstract reviewers are not going to think it's an important study, right? But if your gap is too large and you don't fill the gap, then your audience, your reviewers are going to be more disappointed, right? It's disappointing to read an abstract about something that you're not that excited about, but it's even more disappointing to be presented with a gap and you think, this is really exciting, I can't wait to find out the answer, and then they don't fill it, right? So first is have an interesting and important gap, then make sure that you fill that gap, and then tell us what it means. So don't underpromise and don't overpromise, but getting it right is the key. And if you're working on something that's new and important, right, there's a reason that your lab is working on this problem, the important part is helping your reader understand why it's important, right? Chances are good your problem doesn't have a fundamental problem with being an interesting gap. It's a matter of how do you convince a reader that this is really an interesting and important problem. Okay, the second thing that I want to talk about is this idea that less is more. So as Alice shared, one of the things that I love about our abstract format is that it does allow you to provide the evidence and some details about the rigor that really will help your reviewers understand what you did and how you did it. And so it's important that you include key methods, but not too little and not too much. And one of the ways that I think can help this, and this is something that I like to do when I write, I put this little icon here from the Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, the phone a friend, right? Because oftentimes when I sit down to write technical writing, I get really down into the details very quickly. But if I sit down with a friend and I'm just going to tell them the story of what I did, I will naturally hit the things that are important and skip over the minor details. So it can be a useful exercise to actually do this. Sit down with someone in your lab or a friend over the phone because of COVID, right? And just tell the story of what you're working on. And then go back and look at what you wrote down and see if what you talked about is the same thing as what you wrote. The second thing that I think is really helpful, especially for busy reviewers, is to use effective topic sentences. So if you break your abstract down and you give topic sentences, right? One of the nice things about our abstract structure is that we have intro, methods, results, sections. But these topic sentences will really help your reader understand what you're doing. And an exercise that I like to do in my lab when we write is to have everybody who's writing a paper or an abstract is actually go through, cut out the topic sentences into a new document and read the topic sentences by themselves. And if you get all of the important information in just the topic sentences, you can understand the story, then you have effective topic sentences. And then the last piece is to make sure that you include the most important data. So I want to talk a little bit about the data presentation and how do we do this, especially for an abstract. And this gets us to this idea of showing the data. Now, one aspect here is that this is not a figure for a paper, right? You can't have an A through J subpanels in these figures because your reviewer's only got one page. So you want to focus on clarity and you want to focus on the most important piece of data that fills your gap, right? So if at the beginning you said, this is my gap, and you can show the data that fills that gap, that's going to be effective. Again, for busy reviewers, it can be super helpful to have images or pictures along with the quantification that will give them an idea of the method that you used, how did you gather these numbers, and a sort of visual summary of here's the general trends, right? This one has very little bone and that one has a lot of bone. A reviewer can take that in quickly. But then they can dig in deeper, sort of hierarchical structure in terms of how much information you give them in terms of high information density. And on this idea, I've taken a lot from this guy, Edward Tufts, who wrote a number of books on data visualization. And he has this quote and he says, above all else, show the data. And I think this is a helpful principle. So what I mean by this is don't give extra information in your graphs that doesn't help your reader understand the things that you want them to take out. So give them information, but don't give them these 3D bars and the distracting cross-hatching. All of these things that are not data are actually a distraction for the reviewer. I love this visualization. This is, they call it the Datasaurus dozen. All of these little graphs that we're seeing cycled here have the same summary statistics, same means in the X and Y, same standard deviations, the same linear correlation coefficient. But obviously the data from each one of these graphs is very different. And so what this means is if we can show the actual data, your audience will be able to learn much more than just the summary statistics. So let me talk about how we can do this for the kinds of data that we often have. We all are familiar with these bar plots, and some people call them dynamite plots because what you do with them is you blow them up. This comes from Tracy Weisgerber's paper, where she shows how effective it can be to eliminate these bar plots and show the actual data points as scatter plots. And I think one of the ways that this can be really helpful in an ORS abstract is that it conveys not only information about the groups that you looked at, but also more information about the experimental design and the kinds of information in the experiment. So for example, you could have two groups where they have unequal ends, or you could have a bimodal distribution where there's some responders and non-responders. All of these have the same summary statistics, but they tell different messages. And so you can combine these scatter plots with, let's say, overlay them with a bar plot or with a box plot, and add information density without making it difficult for the reader to skim and then dig deeper. Okay, so with that, I'll summarize. I think it's really important when we present data, especially to someone who's just going to have a few minutes to take it in, that we tell a story. We start with the gap that we're going to fill, and then I think it's important to write it in such a way that the reviewer can take the information in quickly and then dig deeper. And then I think it's always important to show the data.
Thank you, Joel.
So I see that we had a few questions where Dr. Awad and myself will read these and try and give some answers. I think the first question was from Antonio, who was asking a question about consideration for poster presentation versus podium. And so his question is, if you submit your abstract for podium presentation and there are no more available spots at podium, are you considered for poster presentation is the question. So this question seems to be directed to Dr. Huang, and we're lucky also to have Hani here because he can also give you some input. Go ahead, please.
All right, so my understanding is basically the speaking slots are determined after the abstract submissions. So each topic will be apportioned these basically proportionally based on how many abstracts were submitted to the topic. So, and then the number of the abstracts that were submitted and reviewed will then be ranked, and then the cutoff will be determined based on the number of slots. So it's really highly scored presentations will be considered for podium. And so it's really based on the score.
Right, and as Alice mentioned in her presentation, there's a small percentage of abstracts that are rejected, and they're rejected for a number of reasons she articulated. So for the most part, if you don't get a podium spot and your abstract is submitted, the default will be a poster presentation.
Great. So Antonio had another question, but this time is for Joel. Antonio is asking, how do you know your gap is just the right size? I think it's a fantastic question.
This is a great question, right? This is the question that you know, when I think about what is the purpose of PhD training, this is the point of that. The whole PhD training. How do you identify a gap and how do you go about filling it, right? And it's really hard. But one of the things that has been really helpful for me in figuring out, like I know that the problem that I'm working on is important and interesting and is going to change the world, right? But when it comes to communicating it to an audience, one of the things that's been very helpful for me is finding colleagues from different areas to read my writing, right? The people who are in my field, who know my work and know the work in the field, they're going to appreciate the gap naturally, right? But you don't always necessarily know when you send in work, whether this is for a grant or this is for an ORS abstract, who's going to receive your work. And it can be very important to explain this is why this nuanced issue fills an important gap. And so I really like to take my writing to someone who's outside the field and ask them, are you convinced by this argument that this is interesting, right? And for something like an ORS abstract, it's not a huge time commitment to chat about that. So people will be very happy to talk with you.
And I kind of want to add, hopefully you've discussed this with your mentor also ahead of time as you're just setting up these experiments, because this needs to be something that's really, like, you understand clearly ahead of time before you've already done all of these studies if you don't understand kind of like what the gap is that you're trying to address.
Fantastic. So Dr. Farouk Rai also asked a question, and his question is, what is your advice on abstracts that are unpublished now but are published prior to the annual meeting, since we have at least 4 to 5 months window from abstract submission deadline to the annual meeting when the annual meeting occurs? Can you take care of this question?
I mean, I guess my feeling is I don't actually think there's anything that prevents you from submitting as a paper during this lag. I don't think you should hold off on submitting the paper just because you're trying to not have it published by the time the meeting comes around. In fact, I remember somebody who's actually handing out copies of his paper at his poster at the meeting because now, you know, he had the full story. But at the time of submission, it should not already be published. I think it should be.
I tend to agree. I think you do not hold up the publication or the submission of a paper because you have a pending abstract presentation. It's natural for us to expect that this work will result in peer-reviewed manuscripts. And so if you can get it published before the meeting, And all power to you.
Yeah, and on this topic, we talked at the last ORS meeting and a workshop on preprints, bioarchive preprints, for example. This rule on whether or not a manuscript is published before the ORS meeting is talking about peer-reviewed published manuscripts, right? These are papers that have been published, not non-peer-reviewed preprints that are up. So I think there's a distinction there too.
So the next question is from Stephanie, and Stephanie's asking, can underlining and bolding of topic sentences be used in abstracts, similar to how they'd be used in a grant, for example?
Yeah, I can take this one. So, I tend to minimize the number of special characters and bolding and underlining in the writing that I do. And I think for a one-page abstract like the ORS abstracts, I don't know that it will help you that much. But I do like to use white space and put those topic sentences at the front of the paragraph so that they're very easy to identify. And when you think through, how do you, if you were to grab any piece of paper and skim it, right, your eyes would naturally hit the first sentences of every paragraph. So I think that might, for this purpose, it might be more effective to use that.
So Menarim is asking a fantastic question. And the question pertains to the percentage of expertise in terms of the reviewers. And so is the proportion of clinician scientists or clinician scholars and that of basic translational scientists judging abstract more or less equivalent? And so this is a question that maybe Alice and Hani can tackle.
I'm going to kick it to Hani.
So I think this is a question about really the mechanics of selection of abstracts. And so in the process of submitting the abstract, you are going to identify a topic to which your abstracts belong. And based on the topic, there's usually a topic chair who could be a clinician scientist or a PhD scientist, depending on the topic. So some topics are by nature more clinical and are basically chaired by MDs. And the reviewer panel for those topics tend to also draw more the clinician scientist and the research scientist. And so it's really a function of the focus of the abstract and the topic to which it belongs.
Thank you, Hani. So the next question is from Matt Fisher, who's expressing a concern to Alice. So one concern would be reviewers who feel a proper study needs a hypothesis. And so the question is about how would an abstract would be actually received if it's hypothesis-free study. And so he's asking for thoughts about this and whether the author may be penalized for not, thinking or telling the story in a hypothesis-driven fashion. Excellent question.
Yeah. So I feel like maybe all of us might have a different answer to this, and maybe we should all address this. But for me personally, if you've set up the research question appropriately, why you're studying this and why this knowledge is going to maybe lead to other things like a hypothesis-driven study or like why you really need this data set, if that's been framed properly, then I don't think you should be penalized. In fact, sometimes I see people kind of laboriously trying to wrestle out a hypothesis where it's just like, we think the results will be different. And to me, that's not an interesting hypothesis. So that would be my take. Like, I don't think you should be, but maybe there are people who would.
Yeah, I agree. And I tend to also maybe suggest that if your research is not hypothesis driven, especially if you're exploring, your research could be exploratory. With the advent of the multi-omics, approaches, oftentimes it's a hypothesis generating research, right? And so it's not, you should probably just write it as such. And the good news is you get 3 reviewers to look at your abstract. And so hopefully the other 2 reviewers will not ding you for the lack of a hypothesis if you like the way you presented it.
Thanks. I'll just add that I think one of the ways that hypothesis-driven research gets a benefit is that it sort of naturally establishes a gap, right? Because you are saying, this is what we think is going to happen. Now we're going to test it, right? You have sort of this conflict resolution structure that you find in a narrative or a story. And it can be harder to explain that structure and the gap and the goal when you have discovery-based research. But I think it absolutely can be done, and it can be just as or more compelling than just having, well, here's what we think is going to happen, right? So I'm definitely in the pro-discovery-based research camp. But I do think you might need to do a little bit more work.
I think that this particularly fits within how to tell your story. And so if the gap in knowledge is so big, yet the science that you're proposing, and we see this with forward genetics, for example, or very big phenotyping studies that are going to teach us something really important about a disease that nobody knows anything about. A hypothesis is not necessary. And so I think that this is taking us back to, the impact when you're telling your story so that people pay attention to what you're trying to convey to them and the importance of what you're trying to convey to them. So I agree with the other panelists that one should not be penalized for not having a hypothesis, but it's a fantastic question. Thank you for asking it. Becca is asking us, and specifically she's asking Dr. Wong, she's asking why some abstracts are rejected, and she's curious about the opposite end of the scale. What makes an abstract stand out as, wow, this is a 5?
It's actually a 1, I think, on the scale.
Typically, 5 is not the the good number. So 1 is a perfect score. Go ahead, Alice.
I think there are different reasons for this. So it could be, this is a really exciting technique that hasn't really been applied to this field before. That could be a 1 for me, or a really novel idea, groundbreaking kind of method or something, and that would be more of a technical reason. Or you're telling a really complete story. So kind of like starting from point A and really, as Joel mentioned, taking us through the whole arc, or at the end, I feel like, wow, this is like a body of work and I'm excited to see this paper. I don't know if you guys have additional thoughts on this as well.
That was perfect. I feel the same.
I think the wow factor is also part of the beginning of the story. And I don't like to call it the wow factor. I call it the hook. What makes me want to read more is how relevant is it, how important it is. And so being able to concisely formulate that question in the very beginning is, and the gap in knowledge is going to be determinant in getting into that 1 rather than the 5. So the next question is from Raul. Any suggestion for if you are working on a broad subject of interest, but it's a rare disease, and the title has the disease but not the field? How to attract the reviewers to the broad importance of the study outside of the disease without losing the main message?
Yeah, I think this is one where sometimes different stories have different main messages, right? And you may be doing something in the particular context of this one rare disease, but what you discover has implications in a whole bunch of areas, right? And then maybe that's where you want to start your story. Maybe you want to explain, look, we don't understand how TGF-beta signaling works, but we're going to use this model system or this particular context that teaches us something brand new about TGF-beta, right? And I think that can be compelling. I think again, a way that can help is if you talk to colleagues who are not working on that rare disease, but they come away from reading your abstract excited about what you found, then you've threaded the needle.
Yeah, I think this comes with experience, and you may, if you're a trainee, you may get some help from your advisor about this. I strongly recommend, the key thing here is to know your audience, right? And so one way to know the audience potentially could be if you're working in an area, you're not sure if this is something that's presented in the past, the ORS, is to go search the abstracts and see if similar such studies have been presented, and maybe, just read between the lines to figure out what the main message was and how you can serve up your own message.
So related to this, I'm curious to see what you guys think. Should the title be a take-home message, or should the title be a question?
There are different schools of thoughts. I'd be interested to hear what Alice and Joel think.
I'm trying to remember. I don't think I've ever done a question as the title. But I feel like I remember seeing a paper that did sort of a bioinformatic analysis, or an informatic analysis of papers and citations, and found that papers that are titled with questions get more attention. So maybe it's a good way to go.
Uh-huh.
This year might be the year we experiment with this idea. Yeah. I would say, don't get super granular with your title. Sometimes I see titles and they're like 3 lines long, and it's you have the rest of the abstract to get into those details. So
the last question is from Megan. So Megan is asking, how closely related to orthopedics does my research need to be to submit an abstract to this conference, namely the ORS? I am working on a technology development project. I am starting to apply my imaging technology to musculoskeletal tissue, but most of my data so far are simply development of the imaging technology in cell cultures. What advice do you have for Megan?
I think if you kind of frame your abstract so that people can understand what the musculoskeletal implications will be, then it's totally fine. Yeah. And that this, you give a window to what this overall goal and the overall project is going to go.
I'll just say, Alice, I appreciated your take-home message at the end of your talk, where you talked about what you get out of the ORS meeting. And I would say for Megan, if the community that you're, the papers that you're reading, the directions you're wanting to go, if you're wanting to be part of this community, you should absolutely submit an abstract, because I found this to be a very welcoming and collaborative and collegial community. And a lot of the conversations that I've had at this meeting have completely, changed the directions or influenced the directions of the research that we've done. So, this is my scientific home, and it's my home for the various different kinds of things that we do, right? Whether it's a cell biology question or a bone healing question, you'll find community.
One more question, and maybe a general advice on how to use the real estate. You have one page on which to relay your information. How would you recommend allocating the different components, in terms of physical occupation of that paper?
I really emphasize that you don't shortchange your figures, because they're the most important part, almost, because and you want your figures to look beautiful. You want all the information to be there so people aren't looking at your legends to figure out what's going on. Because often I'll go straight to the figures without trying to then read all the text of what the figures are saying, because I want to judge for myself that that's what the figures are saying.
Right.
So, yeah, don't try to make your figures really tiny just so you can fit more text.
Right.
Yeah, I would say that clarity is more important than thoroughness in a one-page abstract. Right now, and if you can, you get the rigor of your sample sizes and your statistics. Those are really important, right? But you don't have to tell what millimolar buffers you used, right? So I think every kind of abstract is going to have some different flavors, right? Some are really methods driven, and so you'll really want to explain why this method is unique and exciting. And some of them are really exciting in the finding, right? And so I think it can depend on what you're writing about.
Great. So I think it's the top of the hour now. I want to thank, of course, our fabulous speakers, Dr. Huang and Dr. Burkle, for really an outstanding set of presentations and so much insight. I am certain that this is going to be very helpful to everyone who attended this this webinar. I also take this opportunity to thank the ORS for the opportunity to offer this educational webinar to you. Our executive director, Ms. Brenda Frederick, attended the webinar, but also my thanks to Ms. Sherry Centron for making this webinar possible and for allowing my wonderful co-host, Dr. Hani Awad, and colleague Dr. Hani Awad to be here. Please know that this recording is going to be available to you in a week or so on the ORS website. Thank you all for being here, and take care of yourselves and each other.
Thank you all. Thank you, Alice. Thank you, Joel.
Thank you.
Thanks, Hisham.